Hello, everyone. We're on the air. This is Dr. Alexander Rosenthal, the founder and co-director of the Petrarch Institute. I just want to remind everybody that we're having a course, Classical Philosophy and the Virtues, coming up in October, if anyone is interested. If you're interested in the course, you can just email me directly at alex.rosenthal@petrarch-institute.com. We're always interested in getting new students. I think you'll find excellence at affordable prices. So today I am here with my longtime friend, Ted Roedel. Do you want to just introduce yourself briefly?
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Ted Roedel, and it's a pleasure to be a visiting scholar at the Petrarch Institute with my old and very dear friend, Dr. Alex Rosenthal. I just recently returned from China on a stint there teaching history to students in China. But I'm back in the U.S., and I'm just it's wonderful to share this time talking about Petrarch.
Excellent. Yeah. So, I mean, today I'll just introduce the topic. Today, the topic we're going to discuss is one which is much discussed in political philosophy these days, and especially is associated with the work of Leo Strauss. The ancients and the moderns, right? The conflict or the tension between the ancients and the moderns. And I thought Ted would be an excellent guest to have because we've had a number of discussions over the years on precisely this topic. Sometimes Ted sometimes takes the modern perspective in our sort of Platonic dialogues and so forth, and I thought he would be an interesting guest to have on. But I guess what I should begin with is to discuss a little bit what we mean by the moderns, because I think when many people think of the moderns, they think of the latest gadget from Apple or Microsoft or whatever it is, right? The latest software and so on. Political philosophers use the term in a very different way, right? Well, historians often think of modernity as being the last 500 years, right? But in terms of political philosophy, we're talking about a movement of thought which probably really gets going around the 17th century and is associated especially with the rise of liberalism and the liberal discourse. And we don't mean liberalism here in the sense of American political discourse, where it means a certain kind of ideology. We mean what is probably very familiar to most of us from things like the Declaration of Independence, right? An idea of society based on the individual and individual rights, notions of free markets, the centrality of freedom, and
especially the idea of a free contractual relationships is a key part of the idea of modernity, I think.
Exactly. And so, like, I was thinking, the relationship between the ancients and moderns is very complex and interesting. I mean, we might think, first of all, that many of our basic political terms and institutions actually descend from the ancients, right? You can think of the concept of democracy itself, right? The concept of a republic, the notion of citizenship. Think about all the various institutions that we associate, for say, with the American Constitution, right, with its Senate and so forth, right? So there is a very strong classical influence on modernity. But on the other hand, what political philosophers have tended to emphasize are some of the contrasts in ways of thinking about politics between the ancients and moderns. And there are three basic ideas that I think we could talk about in terms of potential divergences or contrasts. So first of all is a contrast about what is the purpose of politics, right? Why, for example, does, if we want to call it the state or political authority, civil authority, why does it exist, right?
What is it for?
What is it for? Exactly. And the ancients are associated with the view that virtue, the virtuous life, the good life, right, is the central purpose of human social and political existence, right? The moderns are associated with the view that the purpose of politics is essentially the protection of rights. The protection, think of the Declaration of Independence. Governments are instituted among, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So there's a seeming contrast there. Now,
And it's a very important and vital ambiguity when we talk, because in today, in our world today, we also talk about the good life. But we often have in our own day, we have we have a conception of the good life, which I think contrasts interestingly with that used by the ancients.
yeah, and that leads me really to the second thing, right? Which is the notion of a universal good, right? So for example, in Aristotle, if we take him as a paradigmatic figure of the ancients, he believes that there is an end, a purpose, a supreme good for humanity as such, right? And this end will relate to the performance of what he thinks is our human natural function, the life of reason or virtue, right? And that this is a universal end which all human beings share. It pertains to and perfects and fulfills human nature, and this is going to structure his view of politics. If we look at a paradigmatic modern like Thomas Hobbes, who Leo Strauss thinks, in spite of his somewhat authoritarian conclusions that he draws from it, Leo Strauss thinks is really the forefather of liberalism. You know, his view is, as he says in chapter 11 of the Leviathan, there is no supreme good, right? Everyone basically has their own desires, their own pursuits, right? And there is no universal good, right? And this, I think, is a tension which is very important to explore. Before I go to the third one, did you want to say anything more on that, Ted, or?
Well, it's there is definitely an important contrast there. And I think that if for the ancients, the purpose of politics is to make good citizens. You know, I think to modern ears that sounds a little strange. That we're supposed to be, that the purpose of politics is for us to be good citizens. I think the modern ideal is that the purpose of politics is to maximize freedom rather than to maximize virtue, to be good in some sense, which is universally understood. I would say that would probably be the main contrast when we talk about both sides have universal ideals, right? Both the modern and the ancient attitudes are universalistic. It's just that the modern attitude wants to really put the emphasis on freedom and individual freedom, and freedom understood in terms of individual fulfillment. The fulfillment of individual desires.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that is an excellent point, Ted. And if you look at, say, Pericles' paradigmatic speech on democracy in the funeral orations, right, we would expect a modern politician to, for example, tout the liberty and rights of the people living under the regime, right? But what he says is basically that we alone among nations regards the man who takes no thought for public affairs not as a harmless man, but as a useless man. That's an approximate quote, right? In other words, our glory is the fact that the citizen can participate actively in the polis, right? Mm-hmm. Right. So it's kind of a much less transactional view of politics. But this relates directly to what I think is the third important contrast, right? And again, if we look at Aristotle as a paradigmatic ancient, right, he says in the Politics that man is a political animal. I think it's important that when we think of the word polis, right, it basically meant the city, the community in which people lived, right? So what Aristotle is really saying is that human beings are naturally communal, right? The individual he compares in the individual like detached from any sort of human community. He compares at one point to the Cyclops in in the Odyssey, who's a sort of this monstrous figure. Although he also says that the gods also are self-sufficient, right? But the idea of humans detached from any human community would simply strike the Greeks as being horrific, right? Whereas this is precisely how Hobbes depicts human beings, right? He has that famous phrase about life being in the state of nature, the natural state, as being solitary, nasty, brutish, short, etc., right? So, and politics is something that comes into being through contract for Hobbes to protect the basic right of existence, right? But the natural state is not a communal state for Hobbes. So his political thought, as quite paradigmatic for moderns, begins with the individual. So those are three big themes, right? The theme of what is the purpose of politics, the theme of the supreme good, which is very closely related to the first, and this issue of do we begin with humans as a communal being or as an individual, as the natural state of human beings, as sort of an individual isolate or this communal life. So maybe we can just go through each of these issues, see how far we can get, and we'll start with the issue of the purpose of politics and its relationship to rights and freedoms. And Ted, do you want to say a little something about that?
Yes. Well, I think that, again, just going back to this really delicious ambiguity of this phrase, the good life, right, which means something as the end or purpose of politics, and that's something which is when we contrast Aristotle and Hobbes, and they talk about the good life, they're talking about different things, and it's one of the things which is, you know, when we contrast the ancients and the moderns, it's a very worthy exercise, because the ancients and the moderns alike belong to our Western political tradition. Right, the Western political tradition, you know, begins with the ancients, and it culminates with the moderns. So it's there is with Aristotle, with Hobbes, we're talking about a progress of thought which has led up to our own time. And so if we talk about them being contrasting figures, then we're talking about somehow these contrasting ideas ultimately culminating in views we have today, or at least into a alternate set of emphases that we have in our world, in our Western political world, in our Western political ideals today. And you know, I mean, I think that one of the things that Aristotle understands as important is key to the good life is that we have well-being. We have well-being, and it's really very important to understand what Aristotle and the other ancients mean when they say that the ultimate good is to have well-being. Hobbes, in contrast, instead really talks very in terms. Hobbes is a modern figure, and so he'll talk in language which is maybe more familiar to us. And he will say that the good life is the fulfillment of desires, right? And in many ways, you know, we can readily understand that as modern people. We can readily grasp that. You know, the good life is what we see, you know, in lifestyles of the rich and famous, right? It is getting just what you want to have, right? And then if something new comes along and you want it, getting that, right? There's a kind of, for I think one important contrast between the ancients and the moderns is that for the ancients we have a true nature, which is once it is fulfilled, we have a kind of a feeling of we have a fulfillment, right? A sense of fulfillment as well as an achievement. For Hobbes, it seems that the most important thing is the ability to grasp after what we want, to not be interfered with when we seek what we desire, and the implication is that there is really no limits placed on our desires, and that can lead to conflict. And if anything, the purpose of politics is to try to not seek a kind of fulfillment for everyone, but instead the purpose of politics is to try and stabilize or bring some kind of peace to a circumstance in which everyone is jockeying for the fulfillment of their own desire. And that's how I would sort of contrast them. I mean, it's again, in the modern world, freedom means the freedom to pursue what you want to have, and that's I think the most important contrast with the ancients.
Now, I think those are important points to raise when we're thinking about desires, because it links to the second issue that I raised as a contrast, is this notion of a supreme good, right? Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I think Aristotle and Plato, for that matter, right, would recognize that human beings have a variety of desires, right?
Yes.
But their concern would be, well, how do we know which desires will lead to this true fulfillment of human nature, right? Which is this life of moral and intellectual excellence, the fulfillment of human faculties, right? So, for example, Aristotle says that the person who simply, there's a hierarchy of desires that we have, right? We have desire simply, for example, to eat and gratify our sexual impulses and these sorts of things, right? But Aristotle compares a person who simply pursues these things as, pursues these things as their chief aim in life. As a bovine life, right? A life which is really much closer to the animals than a properly human life, which will be a life of reason. And I think that this gets to the challenge that the ancients would raise, and maybe you can try to address this, is the challenge on the centrality of freedom. Well, they would talk about freedom too, right? But freedom would include freedom from the compulsive force of one's desires, right? Socrates says this in the Memorabilia of Xenophon, right? Do you call the man who's governed by his bodily desires free? Like he's questioning it in a rhetorical way, right? And so the idea would be freedom can be the freedom to act on one's desires. We define simply acting on one's desires as freedom. Can clearly be, for the ancients at least, very clearly either bad or good, right? If one has, a desire for endless self-indulgence of all their passions, they're likely not to be a particularly virtuous person. So, in fact, the life of the virtues frees the human being by disciplining to a certain level the passions, right? And so this idea of the supreme good, if we believe that man has an end, right? If we believe that there is a purpose in human existence, we will tend to judge freedom in terms of what gets us there, right? Mm-hmm. And that would be how the ancients really view it. It seems, and I'm curious how you would respond, right? I mean, it seems like for Hobbes there is no real purpose. In fact, he sort of says that explicitly. They're just desires, right? There's no particular place that we're going, and in that case, how do you discern the difference between good and bad desires? And isn't this ultimately, I mean, from the ancients, wouldn't this really be a slavish conception of freedom? Just being more or less enslaved by your passions and following your desires blindly. So I framed that a bit, perhaps slightly politically, but I'm just curious how you would respond.
Yes, well, I think the I mean certainly I think that this uh, this notion of freedom can't be spoken of in an unqualified way for the moderns. I mean, the moderns I think take it as their highest value, but it has to be properly understood. I think that really what inspires the modern attitude about freedom is two things: the original experience of being able to do what you will. We all have the experience that we can do as we please. We know that there are many things which are disapproved of, but nevertheless, it is part of just our natural imaginative faculties that we can try to do whatever it is we want to do, and in spite of the disapproval of others. And that original experience of real freedom as being the freedom to do wrong if we choose is something which is seems to be that original experience seems to be neglected, perhaps, by the ancients, who, in their emphasis on virtue as real freedom, seem to not take account of our original experience. That may also be why. Maybe why the attitude about political freedom in the moderns is centered on the individual. Before the prerogatives of the community. And it's alone in our room, we can imagine to do as we please. We can imagine to get back at our boss. We can imagine all manner of torture we can inflict on our boss. Things that we'd like to do, right? Whereas this kind of, that is sort of our original experience, and it is a individual experience prior to, in a sense anyway, prior to our political engagement. And so that's something which has to be reckoned with when we are talking about what the true purpose of, what our true end is. We have to, and so that's something you said for the modern concept of freedom. Now, there is I think the modern concept of freedom involves a kind of feeling of when the real basic aim of modern freedom is what it basically aims at is control. It wants to it seeks freedom from the control of others, and it involves also at least some modicum of an ability of the individual to impose their control on their environment, and it's and that is probably core to the ideal of modern freedom, this ability to be free of control of others and the ability to impose some degree of control of your own on your environment.
I suppose that would relate somewhat to, well, the view of Hobbes and later in the 20th century, right, Berlin, on negative freedom, right? So the modern concept of freedom, when I say I have freedom of speech, it means nobody can obstruct my speech, right? And this would be contrasted with, say, an ancient view of freedom would be you're free, yes, if nobody can obstruct it, but also if you can control your mouth.
Exactly.
As it were, right? Like in other words, that there is a kind of self-mastery that you have, that you're not a slave to your desires, this type of freedom seems to be de-emphasized in the moderns. Do you think that that's true?
I think so, and I think this is one of the important contributions of the ancients is their conception of freedom places equal emphasis on self-mastery, self-control, and not just control of one's environment, not just freedom from interference and ability to impose yourself. It's also self-mastery is something which is, I think, de-emphasized in the modern tradition. I mean, the main, but there's an important reason for that, maybe, and that reason might be simply that it seems as though the ancients forget about politics when they start to talk about virtue, in the sense of when they purport to identify a truly universalistic conception of the good, they are taking it off the table for discussion, as it were. They're identifying this is the aim, this is the end of human life, and the question is how to they supply us with a substantive end, and the question then is how to best achieve it. Whereas in the modern tradition, there is perhaps by modern times people had enough experience with substantive claims about the end of man being divisive, that instead people decided to rely instead mainly on the means, not on the means of discovering the end, which is an exploration, a freedom in exploration.
And I think one should say also that a key factor would be, and I think this is discussed by Strauss as well, is that the teleological framework that Aristotle was working with kind of breaks down with modern science, right? So for Aristotle, everything in nature has an end, right?
Yes.
And it would just be a matter of fitting human beings within this natural framework, right? What is the end of man? Right? And so there is something sort of outside and beyond man, nature, which specifies ends, whereas that sort of whole worldview kind of falls away. But for consideration of the time, we should probably turn to the last theme, which we've already touched on, which is this theme of the community. Of the community and the individual, right? So Aristotle is quite clear in Book 10 of the Nicomachean Ethics, which is the transition to the politics, really, right? Those two books are really belong together. That one can only attain the life of virtue really in the context of the community, right? And so that part of human nature and part of attaining our end will be this life in community, this life in the polis. And in the beginning of the politics, he gives two, I think, important arguments for why human beings are naturally political, and political here, and the Greeks didn't really distinguish state and society the way moderns do, right? So we're thinking also like just communal, right? Why human beings are natural communal, he uses two arguments. One is the power of language, right? The gift of language, which distinguishes human beings from every other creature. Why would we have language other than to communicate with our fellows? And the second is that the individual considered in and of himself is not self-sufficient, right? There are animals, solitary animals, effectively, that only meet with their own kind to reproduce, more or less, right, and live out most of their lives alone. But they are fitted for doing so, whereas human beings sort of require others for survival, and by nature, and this kind of cooperation is essential to human survival, and sort of the polis, right, which is a collection of families, we could say, is sort of the lowest level at which we can talk about the human being as being self-sufficient, right? Human being is self-sufficient at the level of the polis. And of course, the moderns have a strikingly different view with their whole notion of the state of nature and of contract. So wondering if you could maybe comment a little bit on that.
Sure. I think I mean Hobbes speaks of a myth of the founding of society. Hobbes has a certain mythical account of the founding of society, and of course, by myth, we're not talking here about a made-up story, so much as a narrative schema, as it were, describing how it is that the rationale that exists for humans to exist in community. And I don't think, I mean, it's been said many times before, but I think it's worth reiterating here, is that Hobbes' mythic narrative of the origin of society shouldn't be taken literally. I don't think he thinks that, you know, people are just wandering around in the forest by themselves, bump into one another, and decide that they have to duke it out in order to achieve some kind of accommodation with each other. Instead, I think that that Hobbes' mythic narrative account about the origin of society instead pertains to that other part of that other side of our essential communal nature, which is our essentially competitive nature. We seem to we are utterly reliant on life in community, but we cannot seem to live in community without active struggle with even our most intimate relations. And this seems to be, if we're talking about human nature, this seems to be as much, this pattern of competition and conflict seems to be as much part of human nature as indelible to human nature.
I mean, Hobbes says that explicitly nature is a principle of disassociation.
Yeah.
So, well, of course, we'll sort of emphasize, you know, its focus on association, right? Nature is an associative principle for Aristotle. You know, we should probably close out about now. I mean, one thing to mention is, of course, the political circumstances of Hobbes and the experience of Hobbes with what Strauss calls the theological political problem, right? The religious and political quarrels that Europe experienced in the 16th and 17th century, which I think is an absolutely essential context for understanding the rise of liberalism.
Yes, yes, for sure.
We'll probably close it out here.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Ted.
Oh, sure. No problem.
I very much enjoyed this little talk. I hope you did too.
I did. It's very illuminating. Yeah.
And hope to join you again soon.
For sure. For sure.